Okay, great. So my name is Krmpotic. I'm on the AEM product management team, and it's going to spend the first 10-15 minutes just to give everyone an update on what's coming in AEM 6.4. Not sure if everyone has had the opportunity to join any of the partner enablement sessions. There are several webinars in the process. So we announced the the latest version of AEM last month in February, and the official launch or general availability of AEM is going to be sometime in April, May, and so you'll have the opportunity over the next couple of months to get more details on what's coming in 6.4, and meetups like these are obviously an opportunity for us to reach out and give everyone an idea what's going on. Also want to thank Mark Infield for hosting us as usual with great pizza and great content. So 4 themes that you'll hear a lot throughout these enablement sessions, whether you join one of the official webinars or if you go to the Summit, is the following. So we basically present AEM 6.4 innovation and all of the capabilities that are coming around these 4 themes, and I'll break them down by AEM Sites and Assets and other modules in a second. But when you see these 4 themes, don't be confused or think that something has changed. It's just that we're saying that as a business user and as customers are transforming themselves and as they're on this journey, a lot of these capabilities or all of these capabilities can be grouped into cloud scale, fluid experiences, content intelligence, and marketing and IT velocity. So it's literally across these modules, and it's trying to address the fact that sites and assets are not 2 silos within AEM, but instead both of these products are supporting various types of use cases and give you the ability to do a lot of different things. For example, fluid experiences, which stands for content fragments and experience fragments, is traditionally something that lives within AEM Assets. So you could argue it's an AEM Assets feature, but then the use case or like the place where you would use experience fragments and content fragments is AEM Sites. So it shows that the limits or like I would say the lines between the different modules in AEMs are blurry, right? That said, let's do the breakdown by the traditional modules, which I think most of you are rather familiar with, is AEM Sites, AEM Assets, and then also Screens and Commerce. So for AEM Sites, and I'll show you a couple of things, we basically continued to work on experience fragments and content fragments and bundled them up in something that's called content services. So in addition to content fragments, experience fragments, it is now possible to expose content from AEM to any third-party system through an API call through JSON. So if you have a custom developed application or a single-page application, then you can easily tap into any kind of content, whether it's a content fragment or experience fragment, through an API call. And these 3 modules, which is content fragments, experience fragments, and the API calls, we call them content services, right? The next thing is the single-page application editor. As more and more customers would love to edit and author content from within AEM, especially for content or experiences that are driven and powered by single-page applications. We did that for 6.4. So for the first time, you can actually support and enable a business user to author content that is typically powered by a single-page application from within AEM. We'll see that in a second. Next, I've already heard it from a couple of people, like Smart Layout. That was a sneak from last year, and it's basically the ability to use machine learning to personalize and automatically rearrange different content blocks on a certain page. So something we're really excited about, because I think out there, when we compete with other systems, we are oftentimes evaluated on how many AI capabilities we expose in AEM, and that's why we're actually very excited about it. Probably not as relevant to today's audience, but it shows that we keep investing in machine learning capabilities. Next is something that's probably very relevant here, core components. So I'll talk a little bit about what's there in AEM 6.4. Style system, I heard that as well earlier over the pizza, is the ability to expose style sheets in the AEM interface so that business users who are not technical can easily change the look and feel of a certain component without the need of you interacting with that. Lastly, Adobe Launch support. So if you know, Adobe has its own tag manager called DTM. It has been renamed to Adobe Launch, and it's basically the 2.0 or 3.0 version of tag management. And we support Adobe Launch out of the gate. So anyone who's using, let's say, any of the other tag management solutions, I highly recommend to have a second look and a deeper look at Adobe Launch, because it really allows us to, I would say, innovate at a level where a lot of the overhead that is being created by the different tags can be reduced to a minimum. Just as a quick note, if you have, let's say, a random AEM website and you use any of the tag management solution, it can easily happen that you have over 50 tags on a single page, and you can imagine that that's impacting the page performance and how long it takes to load. So it's typically a mess. And with Adobe Launch, we're basically making it possible to consolidate all these tags into a fraction of the overall, like the overhead that is generally created by integrating each tag separately. And I think that's going to be the future over the next couple of years. It's not going to be changing anytime soon, but over the next couple of years, I would say the introduction of Adobe Launch is going to make it possible to really reduce the overhead that is being created by the different tags. And then maybe lastly, around AEM Assets, also very, very important in terms of AEM deployments, even though I know that it's not as popular as Sites. But for AEM Assets, we really look at AEM Assets as the content foundation across the entire Experience Cloud and also the connector with the Creative Cloud. And what we did in 6.4 is basically introduce the native support of Creative Cloud applications, which means that if someone uses Adobe Photoshop, they can automatically save changes to that Photoshop file in AEM Assets and enable someone in AEM to easily see the changes and comment on that. Lastly but not least, there are like several, and you'll see them, they all start with smart tagging, smart props, smart translations, smart metadata. That's what I mentioned earlier. It's about exposing more AI and machine learning capabilities in AEM. So quickly, smart tagging is the ability to upload assets into AEM Assets and to have the system automatically tag the assets based on what it recognizes on the image. So a lot of you know that it's like a very, very tedious task and something that keeps companies from reusing assets is the lack of like tags. So let's say if you upload an image, it's hard to like find those assets later on if they're not properly tagged. And we introduced something last year that allows you to recognize what's on the picture, and it will automatically tag that picture. So let's say if you uploaded the Eiffel Tower, it would automatically tag it with, let's say, Paris, Monument, France, things of that nature, which makes it then so much easier to find it later on. The problem with what we released last year is that we trained the algorithm on Adobe Stock imagery. So Adobe Stock is our Getty Images equivalent, if you will. And those tags, or like those, the training set that we used to train the algorithm was a little bit too broad. So when you have, let's say, companies like Disney or Coca-Cola or, let's say, Louis Vuitton, those tags from Adobe Stock are not really relevant to their set of assets. So what we did here in 6.4 is the ability to train the algorithm based on your own training sets. So if you upload a certain set of images and there's like a recognizable pattern, the algorithm will pick that up, and for every subsequent image, it will correctly tag it. So as another example, we had Disney, and they had pictures of cups with Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse on it. And even if there was only a slice or like only like a very small portion of Donald Duck to be seen, it recognized it correctly and made sure that assets are correctly, I would say, categorized and tagged in AEM, which makes it so much easier to find those assets. So something I'm very excited about because, like I said, it addresses a real pain point with our customers. Lastly but not least, something I'll mention quickly, smart translations. Smart translations is the ability to search for assets in AEM in any given language that you want to. So one example is if you, let's say, searched for the term man, like any kind of asset that are tagged with the word man, you would, let's say, find 4 or 5 different assets. But then if you search for that in Spanish, let's say hombre with like an example, it would, let's say, return 0 results. So what we did with smart translations is that for searches, it would automatically translate the search term on the fly and return any kind of search result that matches that, even if it's not in that language. And then lastly but not last, last but not least, smart metadata. That is basically to enable users of AEM Assets to define rules as to how that metadata has to be tagged. So I'll show you just a couple of highlights, and then I think my time's going to be up anyways. But like one piece that I want to show you is, let's say, for experience fragments and content fragments and the APIs and the content service. So all three, as I said earlier, is being referred to as content service. So content fragment is basically the ability to store structured text and editorial content in AEM, and then experience fragments is basically the ability to reuse pieces of experiences of pages within different touch points, whether it's mobile or web or emails. And then lastly but not least, that same content that was originally created as a content fragment can then be used in other systems such as an IoT device through an API call, right? So and that's just going to expose and share content as a JSON object. So generally speaking, anytime you heard that the word hybrid or like fluid content or content services, just remind yourself of the fact that AEM now allows you to act as a headless CMS, which means that that content can be managed and created in AEM and can be used anywhere else. So that's, I think, one key aspect that I want to call out here. I'll skip this here, which is like a demo. Okay, so core components, or like the introduction of core components last year. If you remember, we had foundational components for a long, long time. And the issue with that is that anytime you upgraded from one version to the other, you had to basically abandon all of your customized components because it made it really, really hard for you to like carry those over. It was basically impossible. What we decided last year is basically, like a couple of years ago, is to decouple components from AEM. And what that means is that you can use version 1 of core components with, let's say, 6.3, 6.4, 6.5, which means you get to choose which version of a core component you'd use with any AEM version that you use. So that means you decouple yourself from the AEM version that you're running on, and allows you to, I would say, more easily upgrade from one to the other, and it would allow you to like keep some of your customization that you have. That was last year, and those are like some of the components that we basically rewrote and made available. In version 2, you'll see that we kind of extended the list of pieces. So content fragments, navigation, the language navigation, and the quick search are basically pieces that we added here. And then you see that we updated them and made them available as version 1, version 2. So basically, moving forward, there will be more versions, and it will be so much easier for you to like make upgrades from one AEM version to the next. Let me show you this here. So basically, this shows the integration between AEM Assets and the Creative Cloud. So it shows you that when you're in Photoshop, you can enable the creative or the designer to search for assets across not only the Creative Cloud, but also AEM Assets, which is really critical because we believe in the fact that everyone should be able to continue to work in their environment because it doesn't break their flow and allows them to be so much more productive. So in this case, you can see that searches basically work across both repositories. And what that means is if you actually went ahead and checked out one of those images, so in this example here, if you just work on this particular image, you can check it out, which means no one else gets to work on that file. And as someone goes and makes changes to this file, they can check it back in, which means make those changes visible to anyone else in the enterprise. And then what we'll see in a second is that if you went to AEM Assets, the user will be able to see those changes and see any kind of comments that the user made. So if you actually go here, sorry, so if you actually go, so if you switch over to AEM Assets, you'll see now that any kind of comments, any kind of changes to that same asset are immediately visible to the user in AEM, which makes it so much easier for the creative and marketer to work with together. So I think we mentioned that earlier also over pizza is like how hard it is to really build systems that integrates from ideation all the way to content assembly and delivery, which are traditionally done in AEM. But now what we're doing is we're trying to address the middle part, which is like the collaboration between the creatives and the web developers. And then again, you can see here the marketer gets to compare what the change was. They can see the comments, and they can then continue with making any kind of requests as to what should be changed to that asset. Lastly but not least, I would love to show you smart tagging. It's like basically what I showed you, or like mentioned earlier, is we trained the AI algorithm based on a Adobe stock training set, and it wouldn't recognize, let's say, a pattern such as this one for Burberry, right? So the end result would be to make it so that it's recognized as a Burberry pattern, and if you upload like a new set of untagged assets, if you've trained it with enough of your own pictures that are properly tagged, it will automatically detect that. So we'll upload a couple of Burberry and a couple of Louis Vuitton pictures, and based on the training set that you provided earlier, it will correctly tag those. So in the previous version, or like in the version that we released last year, that would not have been possible because we used Adobe stock training sets. In this case, if you went to the properties, then you will quickly see that it like properly tagged it with, let's say, Louis Vuitton. So I hope this is like at a high level, just maybe a quick time check. I think we said like 50 minutes. I think we're good. So I think at a high level, what we want to show you here is that, first of all, these different parts of AEM are really growing together. And if we look at AEM Assets and its content services, those will be consumed by AEM Sites. And a lot of the AI and machine learning capabilities that we're working on are really critical to a lot of our customers, and you'll see a big push in that direction. So 6.4 is basically just the beginning. That said, this is just a sneak peek into what's coming in 6.4. At Adobe Summit, we'll have a lot of different sessions to cover these areas of AEM in more depth and detail. And at the same time, if you're not able to join us in Vegas at the end of the month, there are plenty of opportunities for you to join a webinar or to find out more about what's coming in 6.4. So I hope that gives you a little bit of an idea of what's coming, and more than excited to share more afterwards. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Peter. Do we want, I think, maybe open it up for some questions?
Sure.
Are there any general questions on what Peter covered, or even more broad 6.4 questions?
Anything? Don't be shy. So,
He's ready for you. Prolet, hang on, let me get you the mic.
How easy is to upgrade from 6.3 to 6.4?
That's a good question. So I would say that easier than before, but for a couple of different reasons, right? So we all know that, let's say, upgrading from 6.0 to 6.1 or any other was probably harder than before, because we did a lot of changes on the back end, right? So you could argue that the change behind the scenes between 6.3 and 6.4 is not that big, and I see that with a lot of our ISV vendors. So when they check whether an integration still works on 6.4, they have hardly to make any changes, which shows you that what we did is hardly touch the back end, which we did in previous releases. But what we primarily focused on is to add some of these capabilities that we just saw in addition to what was available. So it's not going to be easy, right? So it's never easy, but like I would argue that it's not as bad as for other versions that we had in the past. And it's like related to the fact to whether you completely re-engineer at the back end or not. And in this case, we did do that. Does it? Yeah.
Can you say where AI is going with the platform? Because in 6.3 it was a little bit gimmicky. 6.4 it seems like it's more practical with smart tagging where you
Right.
can actually train the library.
Right.
Like what's the future of AI with the platform?
Very good question. So exactly, as you just said, I would say we started to dabble into the AI use cases a couple of years ago or so, or like, maybe earlier than that. And then we felt like we were not being recognized for some of the work that we did in the past, so we introduced like the umbrella term sensei, right? And to your point, I think initially it was about let's say, releasing and making broad use cases available, such as the smart tagging. And as the team grows, and as we as an engineering team, as product team, get more comfortable and more knowledgeable, especially around the use cases, they become a little bit more purpose-driven, right? So I would say exactly how you described it, like over the next couple of years, it will continue to be that way, that it's going to be very, very purpose-driven, as we just saw with like the tags and the recognition and specific use case around metadata management, or even something that I've been working on around digital rights management. It's about real and very specific use case as opposed to, as you described as, let's say, gimmicky. So exactly as you would guess, it becomes more crisp and a little bit more, I would say, applicable, right?
Any other questions? Well, thank you, Peter.
Absolutely.
Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Always.
And we'll be seeing you. You're speaking. You have a few
Absolutely.
presentations.
Oh yeah.
At Summit.
So for those who are joining us at Summit, I have one session around how to use AEM and Adobe Target with each other. It's something that I feel like a lot of customers always run into issues. There are like a lot of different types of best practices as to when to use Adobe Target, when to use AEM. And I think it's like the third most popular session, which doesn't mean that I'm that popular. It just means that that topic is something that a lot of customers struggle with, which means like personalization at scale. How do you make sure that you get to personalize as many pages as possible?
Has joined the conference.
And it's like one session that I'm going to do on a Thursday with Brian D'Amato, who some of you might know. And this one session, another session is on Adobe Analytics and AEM. That's something that I'm going to do on Tuesday, and it's like same thing where we talk about how to really leverage and use AEM and Adobe Analytics with each other. Lastly, third session is around digital rights management. Someone from Bass Pro Shops is going to join me on stage, and we'll talk about digital rights management use cases and how you can use actually AEM Assets and machine learning to not get sued. So I'll give you just one example, which I think it's funny. One of our customers was sued for showing a person that is paddling on a canoe without a life vest. And given that it was a photo shoot, they didn't think of having a life vest, and it turns out that it's illegal, right? So how do you make sure that as you use commercially, like commercial pictures, how do you make sure that you're always compliant with certain laws and regulations that no one would think of? Another example, then I'll leave it at that, is that, let's say, a French automaker was sued for using for showing a picture of an SUV out in the mountains. And again, that's illegal in France because it would promote bad behavior. And those are like the kinds of use cases that we're trying to solve for our customers, because what we see is that oftentimes that someone would get sued for, let's say, $500,000, and that money is gone. It means that the entire marketing budget is depleted for the rest of the year, and none of the stuff that we just looked at in terms of content velocity and collaboration matters anymore because that money is gone, right? So very, very interesting use case that we're going to cover with Bass Pro Shops.
Well, thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
And I'm terrified to hear the types of BAS lawsuits that we'll be hearing about during. Next up, how many people are going to be going to Summit, just out of curiosity? We got a few. Great. Well, I hope you make it to Peter's demo. Here we have Ryan Keenan is in from our Denver office and is going to talk about rendering.
Granite Render Conditions. Can you guys hear me? Louder? All right. my presenter, Kevin? I think it's still trying to show Peter's screen. I must need to check on it. I promise that's not the slideshow. Adobe Connect died. Google Slides crashes it. Yes. Yes. Hide a few things, like move the comments down and click on this arrow. All right. Is that a little bit better, a little bit louder for everybody? All right, so we are unfortunately not going to be full screen on the presentation because that causes issues with the Adobe Connect. But my name is Ryan Keenan. I'm a senior developer at Infield Digital. And today I'm going to be talking about custom Granite Render Conditions. So a little bit of an agenda. Obviously, there's going to be an intro, and then I'm going to go ahead and go through a little quick demo for you guys to show what exactly happens and what a Granite Render Condition can do for you as far as enabling your authors and managing your content. And then, of course, conclusion and any questions at the end. So as far as the introduction to Granite Render Conditions go, they are a tool available to you exclusively in TouchUI, and it is something that will
let you enhance an authoring experience for various different levels of authors, ranging from your standard content author, who is just going to be on a page, authoring generic content, essentially sticking to all the brand guidelines, for example, that are already in place when using the actual components that have been developed for the instance. But at the same time, with the render conditions, you can enable your power users, who are people who have more experience in the platform, for example, people who actually have some sort of technical knowledge so they can actually apply. In the example I'm going to give, something that a technical author would be able to do is add a custom CSS class or custom inline CSS, because it's someone that will hopefully know exactly what they are supposed to be doing with the component technically, and what nudging it to the left or right, for example, will actually do to the overall layout on the page. So this demo itself is going to be running on AEM 6.3, unfortunately not 6.4 yet, but this is something that is available out of the box. The demo obviously is going to be a customized version of it, but there are render conditions that are available out of the box. There are, I think, 5 or so of them, one of which being the simple render condition. And the simple render condition, essentially you just provide it an expression and it evaluates the true or false, and you have access to all of your various JSP context variables. So something, for example, is you could have a URL parameter saying just any sort of query string essentially, and then in your dialog you would have an expression looking for that query string, and if it's in the URL, then some field shows up. If it's not in the URL, then the field that has the render condition on it is going to be hidden. So that's the simple render condition. There are others available, one of which is privilege, which is really related to specific permissions on a node, such as read, write, etc. So that's kind of the overall usage of Granite Render Conditions. And obviously, as with everything in AEM, it is possible to extend it, which is what I've done here, and is what I will be showing you guys in this quick demo. So what I would call a relatively standard use case is something that I mentioned previously, which is adding a custom CSS class or custom inline CSS to a component. Obviously, that's something that can be leveraged by inexperienced authors to move things inappropriately or break sites altogether. So it is not something that you want every standard author to have or be able to actually use. So this, the demo itself is a simple project I put together using the AEM Maven archetype. So this, everything that you see here is going to be essentially something that you can generate base with Maven archetype, except for, of course, the customizations on top of it. So what we have here is just the standard page that comes out of the box with the archetype. I took out the other extra components such as title, text, stuff like that. But this component itself is we were talking about core components earlier. This is actually the core V1 image component that's used here, with a slight modification to the dialog itself. So I am currently logged in as the admin user, and when we go ahead and click edit on the image component, we can see we have a dialog here. 2 tabs, regular base image tab, which is just going to be your standard properties like the actual asset, alt text, all that stuff. And then we have the advanced tab over here, which is where an author would go in and add a custom CSS class or potentially inline CSS to move the image around on the page layout, to give it a nudge left or right, or just give it different behavior in general, something that is not or was not originally intended necessarily with the actual component, but is something that is possible with helper CSS classes, like adding padding to it, for example. So the customization that I have has essentially exceptions for the admin user himself, his or herself, and the administrator's group. so that they will always have access to everything, as they should, because it's the admin user. So logged in as admin, of course, we can see all the properties available to us with the actual component. But if I go ahead and log in to this as Joe Author, this user is, I can show you guys actually, this user, specifically Joe Author, is just in the Content Authors group. This is the out-of-the-box group for content authoring, just basic permissions for creating and modifying content. So what we can see here is when I'm logged in as Joe Author, we can see I can only see the image tab. I can only see the basic properties available to your standard content author. So there's no way that I can actually go in and try and add these properties, provided, of course, the content author does not have access to CRXDE. This is all that your regular Joe Author is going to be able to see and modify. But if we go to the same page, but as Joe Power Author, we go ahead and log in. When we modify this component, we can see we have the Advanced tab again, and that is because the Granite Render Condition is looking specifically for group membership in this case, and Joe Power Author, as you can guess by the name, is part of the Power Authors group that I've created on the instance. So he can go ahead and go into Advanced and add any custom CSS that he wants, because he has essentially been given permission to do so based on his group membership. So that is pretty much the experience for the authors as far as the way the Granite Render Conditions actually control it. It is not limited to any specific item, essentially, in the dialog itself. You can do it, as we saw here, you can do it on tabs. You can do it on individual fields. If there is a specific field that you don't want an author to be able to modify, or your regular author to be able to modify, you can put that specifically on a field to control the permissions for that. And that's pretty much the actual differences in the authoring experience. And it's for anyone who's wondering, because I actually looked, the way that it's rendered is that it's not just like CSS to hide it. It's actually not even rendered at all, so they can't hack it, if you will, to go in and actually just say, well, I'm going to change this input value and then submit the form. It is not actually there at all. So now I'm going to go a little bit into the actual code for this to just show exactly how it's managed on the code side. So this is the dialog XML for the image component that I have slightly modified. This essentially just, the only difference is this whole advanced tab here is something that I've added because this is not available on the core component itself. But I have added it here for this exact purpose. So we have our custom CSS class here and inline CSS here, as we saw in the dialog. And then this is the actual node for the tab in the dialog. And then this is the important part. This is the Granite Render Condition. And as you can see, it is called exactly that. Its resource type is a component, essentially, that I added in here to control this behavior. And then there is an extra property on here to essentially specify what groups have access to this node. So this is something that would be decided on by a developer. So it's something that would have to be included in requirements for a component, for example. If there are more advanced items in the dialog itself, it's going to be something that will need to be defined beforehand so that it can be added by the developer so that it's actually hidden. As you would expect, this is not something necessarily that's actually authored. This is something that is just purely development driven. What I've done for this is this actually has an OSGI service associated with it that will do the check. And the reason that I've added that is because this property here is actually technically an override. This up on the screen is for if you have a specific group that you want to access this node, for example, then you would specify it here. But what I have done is made it so that there can be essentially global control over this, so that you don't necessarily need to specify on every single node, oh, only this group can access it. There is actually, I set it up so that there is OSGI properties here so that you can go into the service and specify yourself a list of groups that can access it. And so this is essentially the default list of groups that can access all the advanced properties. So if you have Granite Render Conditions specified on all your different advanced tabs, for example, you won't need the extra principles property on it unless there's a specific use case for it. Like this, for example, is for driving the display, the advanced like CSS essentially for the component. But another use case I can think of is having another tab, for example, or another field for something specific to analytics, such as adding data attributes. There may well be a group of AEM authors that obviously know that better, and they're going to be the power users in that field, essentially. So if there is another field in the dialog specific to analytics or specific to really any other field that is something that you can segment authors into, then you can specify it on the actual dialog level instead of relying on the default project level. And so let's go into a little bit how the actual render condition works. It is just a simple component. It is a JSP component that just has a little bit of Java in it to actually set a request attribute that is essentially just a Boolean. So there is a back-end service driving this, and as we can see here, all we're doing is we're creating an access render condition in the request attribute. And so we can go into that file. All that this does is this implements the render condition Java class that exists already. This is obviously all of this, the render condition stuff, as I mentioned, is available out of the box, so I'm just extending it. And so all that this has is the check method, and the check method returns, like I mentioned, true or false for whether or not a user can access that specific resource. So that's essentially how simple this is. Obviously, we have the service as well. All that the service does is a little bit of simple user management to look at the user node itself, look at the groups that are specified on the actual, either the node level in the dialog or via the OSGI config for the defaults. And it just checks if the user is a member of said group or groups. And then it will return true or false to either show or hide it. So there's really not a lot to this. I was looking into this originally because it was kind of a requirement that was defined for components. And I actually, obviously, started off on Google, and I found Nate's blog actually on this. It's listed in the slideshow that I have as one of the resources that I use, because he also actually has a full demo on this for a slightly different use case, but it is still customization of the render conditions. So with that, conclusions essentially we can draw from that is to extend this. This is relatively easy. You can easily add restrictions for your more advanced options or for your more specific options like analytics that I mentioned. It really gives you flexibility in your content management while also increasing the governance around it to avoid breaking things, because there is a lot of time that developers will spend essentially just fixing an authoring issue just because someone put something in the wrong place and broke things. So that's essentially the goal with this specific render condition, is to increase flexibility while maintaining the confidence in the actual site stability, so that you can ensure that all your content is still within brand guidelines, for example, but keeping the flexibility of slightly modifying your layout. couple of resources here. This is all available on the Infield Digital GitHub account. And also I added the link to the actual render condition documentation from Adobe, and then, of course, Nate's blog post. So that is essentially the overview of Granite Render Conditions and the specific use case that we came up with. So with that, are there any questions from you guys?
Prolet.
Can you give us more examples of other use cases that you would use this functionality for?
For render conditions in general, or for the specific customization?
For render conditions in general.
For the most part, it is going to just be controlling or modifying the actual authoring experience. It can be used for showing and hiding based on permissions, obviously, but it can also be used for, I guess, something else is if you want to be able to share a link with a specific author, like I mentioned with the URL parameter, you can do that. If you want to have something show up in the dialog that is only available to a user that can actually publish the page, meaning like some property that is specific to published content, you can do that with one of the out-of-the-box ones for the privileges of the user, which again is kind of related, directly related to permissions, less about groups, but it is just overall going to be just driving the actual authoring experience, because as the name kind of implies, it is a condition for rendering. It's just showing or hiding based on certain criteria. So whatever use case is going to require you to actually hide something, a Granite Render Condition is going to be a great candidate for that.
Any other questions? Oh, yeah.
So then, is it, you mentioned just now that like when you want to show or hide, is it literally that binary, or can you do things like have different rendering? Because obviously if I'm an author, I would like to see what are the settings in the advanced panel, even if I cannot edit them, because obviously I want to see what was applied to that particular component.
So with Granite Render Conditions, it is very binary. I believe it is just show or hide, but there are things that you can do with custom JavaScript in the dialog itself to disable certain fields, and you can use like a backend service similar to this to actually provide the data based on the user's information, like they're in this group so they can see it, but they can't edit it, like you were mentioning. That would be something that wouldn't be driven with an actual render condition, but it could be using or leveraging a similar backend service, but then it would be driving the display with more JavaScript that's loaded in the dialog itself.
Okay. Are you sure? Okay. Well, thank you, Ryan. Oh, we've got, sorry.
Question about customizing the authoring experience. Could you apply it to AEM graphical interface, like buttons, like the configure button or delete button for a component, as opposed to just the dialog options?
That's a great question. I haven't actually investigated that. I believe that as long as it is actually rendering with the Granite engine, it will be able to be customized. It would be something that you would have to, you wouldn't be using the out-of-the-box component for that. You would have to override it or overlay it, and then you would add your Granite Render Condition on it. But I do believe that it would be possible.
Thanks.
So is this only applicable for just component dialogues, or overall you can use this rendering condition for, let's say, consoles or even toolbars that are available through various consoles?
To my knowledge, it is going to be available to use any place that there is going to be something that's rendering with, like in the dialog, it's just using Granite resource types to actually control the rendering. So as long as, I believe, as long as it's actually using that same system to render it, it should apply. But it is obviously touch UI, I believe only, so it's not going to be something that you can leverage for like the like site admin, for example, like the actual classic UI consoles that you can access as an admin. I don't believe it's going to do anything there.
Sure, yeah. So I mean, one of the use cases that I can think of is page edit, view where, let's say, a few buttons that I want to show it to just authors, and a power user can have a few more buttons like deactivating or deleting a content.
Yeah.
So just wondering, is this will this give me that capability of showing and hiding buttons?
Yes, but again, it will be something you will have to actually overlay, so it will be a customization on top of it. It's not just like a setting, essentially, that you can turn on. You will have to overlay the actual options for that. Like I believe you're talking about like from the sites.html, for example, to publish or deactivate a page. Yeah, that is something that I believe you would have to overlay, which would then make it custom instead of just, I guess, it's still scalable, but it's something that, again, anytime you overlay some foundation component, something to keep in mind that you may be losing out on features added in the future.
Thanks.
Great. Any other questions? Well, thanks, Ryan. I mean, I think one of the things that's really interesting is we see a lot of sites that are stood up, and it's really the authoring experience. So what's so interesting about this, it's the authoring experience that really, like a great AEM implementation, has really kind of taken the author and taken the business case into account in the design, and also reduces the training time. Because I mean, if we turn everything on, and as you said, there are lots of ways to break the site. So really interesting. Thank you, Ryan.
Thanks.
Do we want to just, Nate, you want to come up and we'll just kind of go through the last, and then we can kind of socialize at the end, or do you guys want to take a break and come back? Maybe just power through? Okay, let's do it. And then we'll post anything that we have. I don't know if Peter, if that's available or not, but anything that's available, we'll post on the site so you can download if you want to see the links or anything like that. It's from just also, we'd like to thank Kevin, who organized tonight, Kevin Weber, who spoke in the last. He did all the work to kind of put this together, so thanks, Kevin. How do you play in PowerPoint? What's the key command? Nothing.
Hello? Awesome. Hello, my name is Nate. I work here in Adobe. It's been about 4 years. I'm going to talk about the next generation implementation of AEM for sites like adobe.com here. I do want to make sure that we realize that I'm talking about AEM implementations and not the AEM product, just because I'm here at Adobe. I want to make that clear. So about me, I've been working on AEM for 5 years or so. I started at LinkedIn. I did Acrobat here, became the engineering manager, and then transferred over to the project we call Dexter, which is the next generation AEM implementation that will end up replacing Adobe.com, Acrobat, a whole bunch of sites. If you want to contact me, it's pretty easy to find. So what is Dexter? It's our internal AEM code base, one code base that should replace, like I said, a dozen or so sites that are all on different, sometimes close code bases, sometimes completely different. It's about code reuse, building once, reusing for the entire organization. It's about sharing resources so that one engineer could jump over to another team and help out immediately. Because we're AEM, it's about being a customer zero story. For instance, we're always on 6.4 early. We try and get Adobe.com on 6.4 before Summit, so we're working on that now. It's about what we call our One Adobe initiative. So that's our design, making sure all these different sites look similar, have a good user experience throughout, and doesn't look like they're built from different organizations or even different companies. Let's see, so currently in our org at Adobe.com, we have lots of AEM sites. We have Adobe.com, we have Acrobat, we have HelpX, Adobe I/O, Marketing Hub, email generation, landing sites, just a lot of sites. And of course, they're all running on AEM. We have forks of forks, and a lot of copy and pasted code. One site creates a cool service that another site decides they need. They copy it over, they alter it. Now we have two different versions. Forks never end up merging back together. You know how it works. So how did we end up this way? You know, it just happens over time. The different business units have their own priorities. They push for what they care about. Has to do with available resources, which teams can provide SLAs for others, different vendor implementations over the years, different reorgs. So when I started here on Acrobat, I was in a totally different org from where Adobe.com is. Now we've reorged together, so we're all together. It makes sense. But when we started, the Adobe.com team couldn't provide the services that Acrobat needed, so we created our own site. I understand why it happened. It's unfortunate from a technical perspective, but the good thing is we're fixing it now. So the solution is one common code base, one code to rule them all, right? Again, we just want to be able to build something once and have it reused everywhere. We want Acrobat to code something and HelpX to be able to take advantage of it. And we want people to be able to jump teams, say dc.cloud is doing a release. We want people on adobe.com to be able to jump over there and immediately be able to start helping because they know the code base because it's the same code. So as we're building, we have to decide, is this feature going to be used more than once? If it is, it should go in Dexter. Each site will consume Dexter. We'll do it through an OSCI dependency, through using Maven and whatnot. And then ideally, each project will have as thin as a layer as possible on it. So we understand each business unit is still going to have their individual needs. But ideally, most of the work that each team will perform will go back to the Dexter code base. Hopefully, it's just maybe a little CSS, JavaScript, maybe a custom component or two. But anything that gets used multiple times should be shared back in the Dexter project. And how do we do that? We're following the open development model. So it's essentially open source, but internally. And of course, since we're also familiar with Sling, Apache projects, we're following that. So anyone who's not on the Dexter project can still contribute back to it. You just fork, submit a PR. it gets approved, and now everyone gets to take advantage of it. So right now, as the project's been ramping up over the last year or so, we have the core team. We act as a Scrum team. We still have deliverables every 2 weeks. We demo just like we're supposed to, and the idea is that everyone's invited. They can come and see what's going into the platform that they're going to end up consuming sooner or later. But ideally, it won't just be the core team contributing to Dexter, it's the entire org, and maybe even more. While we do that, the core team will sort of be the steward of the code base, and they will review incoming PRs. So it's a lot like Apache, how they have contributors and committers. The core team will be the committers. Anyone can be a contributor. So the key for open development is communication. And the primary way we do that is distribution lists. And so when we have larger discussions, things like how are we going to implement e-commerce, that goes on the distribution list so that everyone can see it. Everything's archived. We can always go back to discussions, review why it happened. And of course, we're a global organization, so we have architects in Switzerland, in France, in Germany. They can be involved even though they can't make it to our daily stand-ups. We also have Slack for immediate day-to-day communications. Slack's easy. And then, of course, it's all about documentation. We have wikis. We are using Jira, SonarQube, JavaDoc, READMEs, whatnot. But the key is really to make sure that we're documented really well. So how does a project like Acrobat consume Dexter? You can make it seem a little easier than it is. You just put in a dependency, and it's pulled into the build process. Of course, everything we build goes into our internal artifactory. Ideally, if we're following Scrum, right? Every 2 weeks at the end of Scrum, we have something to deliver. We build and we just bump the version, and then the consuming applications can, of course, choose the version that they want. We haven't been around long enough to really deal with supporting old versions yet, but we have an idea of how are we going to support how many versions back, how are we going to support both 6.3 and 6.4 as we've already started moving to 6.4. So we're going to go through some growing pains like any other team. It'll be fun. But ideally, we're looking at supporting just 3 versions back. So our tenants, being an Adobe team, we want to feature AEM out of the box as much as possible. One of the side effects of being at Adobe, our organization is called in to demo to customers, help the sales team, and we really want to feature AEM, and that works out really well for us. Myself and the other guys on our team are AEM purists, so it's great. So, using the latest content experience fragments, making sure we're using the AEM grid layout, making sure we're working from the core components, even if we have some disagreements on whether we want to do that or not, right? Just essentially following in line with the best practices, Adobe's guidelines on how to use AEM. We want to be that customer zero story. We want to be that shining example of exactly what to do. And again, it's easy to convince us to do that because that's what we want to do as AEM purists. Some of the things we maybe haven't been able to do on some of the other projects because of timelines, deadlines, business units, pushing back on the developers, is making sure we have unit tests, making sure we're following check style, SonarQube, making sure we're fully documented, with the idea that sooner or later we will contribute back. A lot of things we've already done have been contributed back to AEM product, or at least the ideas. So some of the features that you guys will end up seeing have been initiated from discussions from our team. Sometimes we're the first ones to get on a particular version. Let's see. Again, not everything's always smooth. As engineers, we have a lot of people fighting for, we shouldn't be under deadlines. We shouldn't be pushed by business priorities. We should be building, that clean, perfect code. But on the other hand, obviously, you can't just take engineers, let them do whatever they want for as long as they want and not be responsible for deliveries. So it's a balance, right? But essentially, if we let the business dictate deadlines on maybe some complicated architecture like, commerce or whatnot, then we end up compromising and we go back to the same position we were before in other projects where we have technical debt, and we don't want that from the get-go. So it's always a give and take. Let's see, so how are we coding? I'm not going to get too deep into our code, but in a 10-minute conversation here, but essentially, everything's configurable. We talk to all of our different business units. We take the union of what everyone needs, and we build it into the component, make it configurable. Every service, every servlet, every filter is disabled by default. It has to be enabled, and if you want to use it, you have to provide an OSG configuration for it using the configuration policy. And so that way, if, say, HelpX needs to consume Dexter Core, but they only want to use a handful of services, we can do that, and they don't need the rest of them getting in the way. From time to time, so our team decided we're going to start with one core bundle, and then we'll break out bundles on an as-needed basis. So bigger things like localization, commerce, our own testing framework, those become our other bundles. Our consuming applications still get to take advantage of them by using the one dependency in their Maven build process. So another part of having this central code base is we included UI. I was having a conversation earlier where they had a central code base, but they didn't want to put the experience in there. So the consuming application does it. Here we decided to use the components, provide CSS, provide JavaScript, and then again, each consuming application can alter it if they need to, ideally as little as possible. But we're using all the latest client-side technologies, ES6, Webpack. We have Adobe created an MVC framework called Torque that's been deprecated. We're moving to React right now. The idea is that it's design agnostic. Again, any site can change the look and feel of any component. Because we're building for Adobe and we want this one Adobe experience, hopefully it's not too much. But the business units have that flexibility. And again, the idea of being AEM at Adobe is to embrace AEM, not to fight it, not to create your own sort of architecture just because maybe you don't like one piece of AEM. It's really to go with how AEM is meant to be used. It keeps things simple. And at the end of the day, that's really what we want, a clean, simple code base. Let's see. So for example, for our components, the idea, we keep using the term light touches. So we have very simple components. We inherit from the core components, add our little bit of logic on top of it, just little light touches here or there. So when we talk about doing AEM the right way, what's really kind of the funny and maybe a little frustrating part is the right way is to, again, keep it simple and not complicate things. So we have components like CTA, text, title, like you see from Core. We don't create giant heavy components like header, I guess would be a great example, where there's a lot of options, a lot of fields or panels, hiding and showing. It's about keeping it simple and then letting the author do the design. We created a component utilizing the Flex container, which gives the author just so much flexibility to really design things. So if you want to create a header component, you create it out of the simple text and CTA and image. And then we're using editable templates to really give the author the power, the flexibility, and then the reusability. So in our code base, I think we have maybe one or two very basic templates. For us, it's all about editable templates. So in conclusion, again, it's just really embrace AEM, don't fight it. Out of the box with light touches. Following proper development techniques that we all know we should be doing, TDD, wikis, documentation, and really just keep it simple. That's all I have today. It's not as technical as I usually like to go, but if anyone has any questions, this is.
What made you choose the name Dexter for the project?
We voted. Dexter is the name of our VP's or senior director's dog. Yeah. So yeah, for the longest time it was, well, is it Dexter's Laboratory or is it the bloody serial murder Dexter? But no, it's actually our director's dog.
So do you get into a lot of arguments about this team has a service that does pretty much the same thing that these guys wrote a service to do, and then you fight over which one goes into Dexter? Or
so there's no real fighting. I mean, like I said, that certainly has happened. We have the same service in multiple code bases. Our product owner did a lot of good work going to the different business units and consolidating requirements. We have copy and pasted code from the current Adobe.com or other projects. There's no reason to rewrite something if it already works, and we're proud of it. We, of course, have updated to use the latest OSGI annotations and made things more configurable, but there's a lot that has come from the different projects in pieces or in whole.
And then how big are your teams? So how many people work on like the main Dexter project and how many work on like Acrobat.com?
So Acrobat's one of our smaller ones. There's 2 or 3 engineers there right now, not counting QA. Dexter has 1 full-time solution architect, 2 part-time, and 3 engineers. And right now we are limited by having 1 QA, but the rumor is we're getting 2 more. So yeah, there are services I've written for Dexter over the past year that have not been tested yet, so we're a little backlogged there.
Well, he kind of stole my question, but I'm gonna do a little bit of a follow-up. So it doesn't seem like it's too many people actually working overall on the project, so I can understand how it's probably a little bit more manageable. But you also mentioned that you guys are doing like distribution lists with all the discussion. You also have Slack, and you have stand-ups. how, at the end of the day, do you manage to kind of organize and ensure what are you following and what do you end up documenting based on the overall architecture?
So as a team, in the beginning, we decided on our definition of done, and documentation is definitely listed in there. So we can't close a story unless we're documented. If you create a component, there's the help link at the top, and we have to create the page and just make sure it links there. We have to make sure all of our Java code is commented with JavaDoc. Because there's a PR review process, and the rest of the team won't accept it, won't allow you to merge it unless you've met our definition of done. That will also extend to the greater organization as they start contributing back. Again, just like Apache, just like Sling, any of us here can submit a PR, but it's not going to go straight in without people taking a look at it and improving it first. And so as it starts growing and other teams start consuming Dexter and start contributing back, we have started putting tickets in our sprint to actually reserve time to review PRs from the other team.
We have a couple of questions from online, so there's a huge community online. This is just a very small fraction of the people. Just kidding. Parker asks, how much testing do you implement? How much testing do you implement in service component and UI layers? And which tools have you found best for the project?
So I feel like I'm not too qualified to speak for what our QA has been doing. I just haven't been following that part. But he's working on automation. We're using, for our services, we're using standard unit testing tools, JUnit, and we've created our own mock framework so it can be reused. So that we can do a lot of things that we want to do, that you can do, but we can do a little easier with some annotations. It's a lot like the WCM IO. I think it's like even include that.
And then we have another question from Bipin. How does Dexter team handle different business use cases on the same code base? Won't the code come fatty?
It's certainly something we're aware of. Like I said, our product owner has done a fantastic job for us so far. Usually we don't like product owners or slave drivers, but he's done a good job for us on that front. And again, we also have the benefit of, the top-down directive of this one Adobe. So each site shouldn't be too different. But yeah, I mean, there's certainly the possibility that components and services start getting heavier than you like. There's too much logic in there. We have been able to avoid that so far. But, we'll see what the future brings.
Hi. So you mentioned you're using, the latest and greatest ES6, Webpack, Babel, all that. Were there any hurdles or issues you had to overcome also using the core components, which, don't use any of that? They're just plain JS and less?
I can't go too deep because I'm on the back-end side, whereas we have a front-end developer who has mastered all that for us. But we're pulling in the core components in our Maven build process. And so it's just a dependency we update there. We have separate client libs for, publish author for each consuming application has their own client lib if they want to overwrite things we're doing. I don't know exactly what we're doing to overwrite the core stuff in the way of CSS JavaScript.
I'm just curious if, has any of Dexter so far that's gone on Dexter ended up going back out to the open source projects, such as core components? Or
So we have contributed ideas back to the AEM project itself so far, and we're not sure, this is sort of outside of our decision-making level, exactly what will happen to it. We have talked about open sourcing it. We have talked about providing it with AEM like we retail, We have talked about selling it. It's not up to us as engineers. Right. We want to. That's certainly on our roadmap. Flex Container. Right. Flex Container is a great example of something I feel like a lot of projects could take advantage of. We built it right. It works really well. It gives author a lot of flexibility. If any of you are front-end engineers and use Flexbox, you know how powerful it is.
You mentioned that you had a directive from above to basically have the look on different sites similar. Was it the same with the Dexter project? Did you have a directive from above of, hey, unify your architecture and unify your code base? Or did somebody have to go and convince people that that should be done? And if the latter, how long did it take them to convince people that that should be done?
So our product owner will tell you that it originated from him. I think it did originate, and then the idea was sold to management, and it just makes sense. It's absolutely the right thing to do.
In a big company, it's really, really hard to do that. That's why I was curious of how long did it actually take.
Right. Again, things are easier on that front now after a reorg that brought sites like Acrobat and sites like HelpX under the same org with Adobe.com, whereas before we were completely separate. So it was easier to do that. And again, everyone's on board. It's just the right thing to do. Every few years, you need to update your code anyways, and it's about that time for us.
Great. I think we have two more questions, and Bipin wants your product owner.
So as you said, using a common code base for all the projects, don't you think it will be tightly coupled? There is no concept of loose coupling. Each class might assume it can get overloaded with many responsibilities. There is no separation of concerns or nothing like that. Don't you think it's a loosely coupled system or it's a tightly coupled system? What do you think?
I don't think we're going to face that problem too much. A lot of our sites are so very similar. Also, one thing I'd like to mention, I had a conversation earlier. We don't really do multi-tenancy here, so all the projects that will consume Dexter are on their own servers. But our classes are pretty similarly written, right? So things like, if you go to ACS Commons, right, and you pull in the version client lib or something, that will work for multiple projects, right? So that's the kind of services we're writing.
My question actually you answered. I think I was going to ask how exactly it coexists between the projects because I was assuming multi-tenancy, but that completely answers it.
So being at Adobe, we do have a benefit of not having to worry about licenses. So if WebOps wants to spin up 10 servers, so be it. That being said, we are consolidating our servers down right now to behave more like our customers. If we go to them with this demo of Dexter, this is how you should do AEM, and then tell them they need 100 servers, that's not cool. So we don't do multi-tenancy. Our business units are still separate. They still have their separate concerns. A smaller team like Acrobat is not going to be happy being on the same launch schedule as Adobe.com. But despite the fact that each project will have its own set of servers, We all want it to be on the same code base still.
Well, I think a big thank you to Nate for presenting tonight. Also, thank you to Ryan and Peter. These are no good if we don't have people who get up and share experiences. So please, I think everybody here probably has a story to tell. Please contact us. There's going to be another meetup May 15th, and we're trying to kind of get the cadence up a little bit. If you have a story, please share it with us. Give a little, get a lot. If you have questions, send them in. If there's something you want to see, send them in, and we'll do our best to either to find somebody to present on it and share. And I kind of want to wrap things. It's 8:45. I think a group of us are going to go over to Mars afterwards because Adobe wouldn't allow alcohol here. So if you want a beer, please come join us. And